We are reading Fire and Fate by Serena Valentino. This is chapter 4 from the Book of Fairy Tales, The King of the Underworld. After the War of the Titans, Hades was cast away to live with the dead, languishing in the underworld, dreaming of his life before he and his brothers defeated and locked away the old gods. While he had to admit the world was better off without the Titans, his life was not. He was deeply discontented, and he envied his brothers Zeus and Poseidon and the other Olympians who all seemed happy in their new roles, while Hades hated being lord of the underworld. To say it was a dreary place was an understatement. He regretted not standing up to Zeus the day they had divided the realms. Hades was the eldest brother, and he felt he deserved to rule Olympus. But Zeus always seemed to get his way. Just because he had flashy lightning bolts and a mane like a lion, he thought he was king of the world. Of course, he pretty much was, but he didn't have to be so high and mighty about it, sitting on Olympus with the other Olympians and doing whatever it was they did up there. Hades imagined them boasting about their exploits of turning themselves into animals and meddling, to put it lightly, in the lives of humans, and they called him evil. Sure, he had partaken in his own acts of skullduggery. Hades had tricked the goddess Persephone into being his wife, but she only spent 1/3 of the year helping to rule the underworld, and the rest of the time she was with the other Olympians or off in other lands using other names and incarnations. She was the goddess of spring in some lands, and Nestis, queen of the dead, in others. She was rarely in the underworld, and after a time when she was there, she spent the hours in her own part of the kingdom. He hardly knew she was there. For all he knew, she wasn't there at all. The fact was, Hades had become very bitter and lonely, and he had changed. He had done things he was not proud of, out of desperation and anger, so he shouldn't have been surprised his family saw him differently now, distrusted him, and didn't want his company. Frankly, he didn't even want his own company. He hated who he had become down in the underworld. From the instant he took the throne, he was reviled and feared by his family, not to mention almost everyone in the many realms. He didn't understand it. Sure, he had become the ruler of the dead, but he didn't feel that meant he had to change who he was. He felt like the same Hades, but without knowing how, he had become the unseen god, an outcast, with only the dead, his minions, and his dog for company. And he hated it. His life had now been that way for more years than he could recollect, counted only by his increasing bitterness and deep penetrating loneliness. As the years passed, he felt himself growing more vengeful and bitter, becoming the god his family treated him as. He was obsessed with filling his halls with guests, and seeing to it that none of them escaped. Nothing made Hades angrier than some poor soul trying to escape his realm. If he was forced to reside there, then so would they be. This was when he went mad and tricked the goddess Persephone into being his bride. Together, they held elaborate dinner parties for the dead, which became a nightly affair for Hades, even when Persephone would no longer attend them. Hades would meet his honored guests as they had disembarked from the ferry across the river Styx, ushering them through his great fortress and into his splendid dining hall, where he sealed their fates to linger in the realm of the dead for eternity. But all of this felt hollow. These poor, doomed souls were there only at his command, which made him feel even lonelier. The last place they wanted to be was in the underworld, surrounded by despair. They didn't want to be his guests. They wanted to be with their families, with their loved ones, laughing and enjoying the sun shining on their faces, and Hades understood that all too well, because he felt the same. So one night, rather than hold a feast for the dead, he invited his family to dinner, being sure to note on the invitation that he would have his minions obtain the food for the banquet from outside the underworld. He wanted them to know this wasn't one of his tricks. This was his way of extending an olive branch. He wanted to change. He wanted to be himself again, and he thought the best place to start was with his family. He arranged to have one of his favorite halls in the underworld decked out in preparation. He was excited to have it filled with his family and the sound of laughter. He was eager to show them around his fortress, talk of old times, share stories, and prove to them and himself he was still the same old Hades. And he was eager to talk to his brother Zeus, perhaps repair the bonds that had been broken so many years before. He was elated with anticipation as he sat at his long black marble dining table, which was carved to look like a great serpent that twisted its way through the room. The inlaid marquisite gleamed as Hades waited for his guests to arrive. He made sure everything was perfect and that his minions, Pain and Panic, put out his finest black china, the set that had a stunning painting of his profile in the center of the plates, and were trimmed in gold, matching the skull chalices that would soon be filled with honey wine and his favorite, pomegranate wine. He made special arrangements for the honey wine to be brought in from Olympus for his family, along with food from their lands that wouldn't render them eternal guests in his kingdom. The dining chairs were one of his favorite features of the room. They were fashioned to look like dead trees, their leafless branches adorned with the spirits of crows that cawed to one another in harmony by the glow of blue flames in the massive fireplace. The supernatural blue light also emanated from the eye sockets of the countless skulls that composed the walls of this chamber, laid like stone or bricks, making for a macabre dinner setting. He had done what he could to create a space he loved in the kingdom he despised, and this room was one of his little sanctuaries. Hades truly loved this room and wanted his family to love it too, and he couldn't wait for them to arrive. He sat in his dining room, his hand dangling off to the side of his massive throne, carved from black marble and edged in gold. He was scratching one of his dog's heads when he felt one of its other heads lick his hand. "Thank you, Cerberus, but gross," he said, flinging the slobber off his hand and then petting his dog's third head, which looked neglected. "Where are all my guests, Cerberus?" he asked, getting up to pull a braided velvet rope hanging alongside the fireplace. A cacophonous bell rang out through the underworld. "Pain! Panic! Get in here!" The devils scrambled into the great dining hall, slipping on dog drool and sliding across the shining black onyx floor before crashing into Hades' throne. They sat there peering up at him with terrified looks on their faces. Hades had no idea how he had gotten saddled with these children of Ares and Aphrodite when the idea to have them serve him in the underworld was brought to him. He thought it was rather unusual. However, Pain and Panic were renowned for being formidable on the battlefield, so he thought, why not have them in reserve should their services be needed? But as far as he had witnessed, they only proved formidable at annoying him. "Yes, your majesty?" Panic was living up to his name, but not in the way Hades had imagined. He did not cause panic in others, but was often panicked himself, especially when speaking to Hades. He was a timid, sickly-looking creature, and he was all points. Pointed horns, pointed tiny wings, a long pointed nose, and large round yellow eyes that were always filled with fear. He shuddered as he waited for Hades to speak, shaking so much that Hades placed his hand on the creature's head to stop him from vibrating. "Did you deliver the invitations as I demanded?" Hades leaned down and looked Panic straight in the eyes. "Yes, sire, we did," said Pain, causing Hades to look in Pain's direction and narrow his eyes in disbelief. Pain was a round little devil, also with tiny wings and horns considerably smaller than Panic's, and he looked just as frightened as his cohort. The only one to whom he caused pain was Hades. They both looked as though they were bracing themselves for an outburst of anger, which they saw coming. Hades' blue flaming hair was turning red, and the brighter red it became, the more the little devils shook with fear. "Then where, may I ask, are all of my guests?" Hades' head was now burning bright red, a color that reflected his mood, a color that told his minions they were about to be thrown into the river Styx, if they didn't answer in a way that pleased their king. "Well, sire, you see, everyone on Olympus is getting ready for the birth of Zeus's child. They say he will be born within a fortnight. Oh, and sire, Zeus asked us to give you this." Panic's hand was shaking as he handed Hades the invitation for the upcoming birth celebration. When Hades opened the envelope, an opalescent winged horse crafted from paper flew out and circled around his head. Hades snapped his fingers, causing the invitation to catch fire, its glittering ashes raining down on him. "Blah, blah, blah. Zeus's baby. That's all everyone is talking about. Even Charon was babbling on and on about the little brat the other night when he ferried me across the river. I asked him, 'Do you bore the dead with this nonsense? For all I know, they're still alive when they board your damnable ferry, and your stories are boring them to death. This is the underworld, man. What do we care of the going-ons in Olympus?'" He then lowered his voice and leaned down to whisper so there'd be no chance of anyone other than Pain or Panic hearing them, even though no one else was in the room. "So tell me, what did they say when you brought them the invitations? What's it like up there? Are they just sitting around drinking honey wine, laughing and floating on clouds all day?" "Well, sire," but Hades didn't give Panic a chance to reply. He already knew the answer, and he was incensed. He exploded into flames that emanated from his entire body. He was filled with rage and envy. "It's not fair! I don't get to float on anything!" Hades clenched his fists, his head an inferno, causing all the blue flames in the room to burn red. "That's not true, your majesty. You can float on your rivers of blood," said Pain, taking Panic by the hand and trying to inch away. "Silence! Leave me now!" Hades' outburst made the little devils scatter out of the room. His dog looked at him with sad eyes and curled up next to the fireplace as Hades paced his great hall. He realized his family had never intended to come to his party, and he supposed he shouldn't have expected them at all. If he wanted to see them, he would have to go to Olympus. He hated visiting there these days. Everyone was so golden and filled with light, just sitting around being superior and godlike. Nothing has been the same since I became the unseen god, banished down here while everyone up there is glowing and ethereal, laughing and looking down on me, and I mean literally looking down on me. The people used to love me when I was the giver of wealth, but now I'm just a demon who had to trick a goddess to marry him, whose family hates him, and whose only friends are two imbeciles and a three-headed dog. No offense, Cerberus. I hate who I've become. I don't even recognize myself anymore. He glanced at himself in a mirror hanging on the wall, the back of his hand theatrically pressed to his forehead. Am I so terrible? Is the underworld not good enough for them? Too gloomy? Not sparkly enough? Not enough harps? Hades paced around the room as he continued to rant. We have cool stuff down here, don't we? We have fairy rides, rivers of blood, skulls, three-headed dogs. Flames burst from his hands as he gesticulated wildly, then slammed them over and over again on his dining room table, making the china rattle and waking one of Cerberus's heads, which had been snoozing in a puddle of drool collecting under its chin. Hades sighed. Who am I kidding? It's miserable down here, and I'm a monster. Well, if they won't come down to see me, perhaps I should pay them a visit once their precious little brat is born. And without warning, and taking Hades completely by surprise, 3 women appeared in his hall. At first, Hades thought they were dinner guests late for the party, arriving after all, and he felt foolish for being so upset. But when he looked at them, he realized they were not gods, but witches. Witches who, he sensed, were almost as powerful as gods. Witches who could be goddesses if the cosmos aligned just right. The 3 witches just stood there, frozen and bewildered, each of them looking exactly like the other, all of them beautiful in a peculiar way. Their eyes were large and bulbous, and their lips were made to look small and heart-shaped with deep red lip paints. Their cheeks were adorned with pink circles, almost like harlequin face paint, and their ringlets were black like the feathers of a crow. It all looked striking against their ghastly pale skin, and Hades immediately liked these witches. But what he liked most was the power he sensed within them. At last, someone else to talk to. Aren't you a delightfully freakish trio? Welcome to the underworld, my honored guests. You are just in time for the feast I've prepared for you. He played it off like they hadn't taken him completely by surprise, but the witches said nothing. They just looked at him, their heads tilted to one side, trying to take in his measure. What is it with you witches, anyway? Why are there always 3 of you? Is it a rule or something? He knew the answers to those questions, of course, but Hades loved the opportunity to have someone besides his dog and minions to talk to. And he liked the sound of his own voice. He wondered what could be wrong with these witches, with their stark white faces and 2 big eyes, just staring at him and not speaking. I know, it's not every day you get the chance to meet the Lord of Darkness. I'm sure you're a little tongue-tied, but please, sit down. I have been expecting you. Fact was, he hadn't been expecting them, and he was keenly interested to hear how they had found their way into his kingdom. But nevertheless, he motioned to the dining table for them to sit down as he walked over to the velvet rope and pulled it again. He would get his answers over dinner. Pain, panic, bring in the feast! And don't bring that sloppy prepared for my ungrateful family. Bring underworld food and plenty of pomegranate wine, and clean up that puddle, he added, eyeing Cerberus. Excuse the mess, dear ladies. You know how it is with 3-headed dogs. 3 times the drool. He paused for them to laugh, but the witches didn't move from their spot. This was maddening. He finally had potentially interesting company, and they weren't talking to him. Nothing? Come on. I demand you speak and take your places at the table. Let's celebrate your arrival, he said with a wave of his hand, causing the flames in the skulls to burn blue to match his hair. The witch in the middle spoke first. We know. And then the second one took over. You were not. And finally the 3rd witch chimed in, expecting us. Then they all spoke at once. Unless the king of the underworld now takes orders from the fairy godmother. I assure you, dear ladies, I do not take orders from anyone, let alone this fairy godmother, whoever she is, he said, pulling out a chair so one of the witches might take her seat. But they just stood there, looking at him with their big eyes that grew rounder the longer they stared at him. Perhaps they were sizing him up, or maybe they were devising their escape. There was no way of knowing what was going on in their devious little minds. Their power was so great that they had closed their thoughts off to him completely. These witches are strong. Never mind, I'll let them keep their thoughts to themselves. For now, he thought, as he motioned for them to sit down. But the witches just sputtered fragmented sentences at him, which drove him mad. The fairy godmother, she's a wretched, horrible creature. Yes, why don't you tell me all about her over dinner? But first, a little adjustment. He waved his hand, causing all the witches to jump. It was the first real indication they were capable of movement since their arrival. That should do the trick. I cannot abide by the way identical witches speak. It's so distracting and quite frankly annoying. No offense, he said with a flourish of his hands and a smile. The witches just looked at him with their large eyes staring at him with blank expressions and their hands at their throats as if they were choking and unable to speak. Hades rolled his eyes. I see you have a flair for the dramatic. I think we're going to get along just fine. You should be able to speak intelligibly now. Go on, try. He was finding this quite amusing. He decided he was going to enjoy the company of these witches, or if not, then he'd have some fun tormenting them. He stood there waiting to see what would happen when he stroked the feathers of one of his ghost ravens sitting on the back of the chair he'd pulled out for Lucinda. And in case you have any ideas, you should know your magic doesn't work here. Now sit down and enjoy the splendor of the underworld, he said, his head burning with red flames. Well, sorry, Lord of Darkness, but we don't belong here. We are in the wrong place, said the witch in the middle. The witches were dressed identically, all of them in red velvet trimmed in black lace. They looked as if they had been attending a ball right before they arrived, and he was still wondering how they had ended up in his dining hall. That's what everyone says when they come down here, but eventually this is where they all end up, he said while grinning theatrically and doing jazz hands. The odd sisters flinched and jumped back in terror, making him laugh. I'm personally not a fan of the underworld either, but I have a feeling it will be a lot more fun with you three here. I didn't catch your names. I am Lucinda, and these are my sisters, Ruby and Martha, she said, motioning to her sisters who were standing on either side of her. Then Hades realized there was something familiar about these witches, something he hadn't gleaned when they first arrived. You're from the many kingdoms. You don't belong here, and I can smell death on you, but you're not dead, are you? You're descendants of the witches of the Deadwoods. You're the queens of the dead. Hades couldn't fathom how this had happened. Of course, he knew who the Queens of the Dead were, and they knew who he was. All keepers of the dead knew each other. But how were the Queens of the Deadwoods, in his realm now, so unceremoniously? It was unheard of. He would never venture into their kingdom without an invitation. Not unintentionally, at any rate. It was bad form. There had to be a good reason they were there under those circumstances, and he was eager to hear it. We are not the queens, we are the oracles of our land, the writers of fates, and we would be grateful if you could return us to the many kingdoms, said Lucinda, who looking rather taken aback to be speaking independently from her sisters. Don't worry, you'll get used to speaking intelligibly, he said with a sly, cheeky grin. The odd sisters grimaced in silence. Interesting, he said, continuing to pet the ghost raven on the back of the chair he was still waiting for Lucinda to take. Interesting indeed. Clearly you're telling the truth. Then take us home, demon, spat Lucinda. Hades laughed. Look here, witches, I'm in charge. This is my kingdom, so if I say sit down and enjoy a delicious meal with me, that doesn't mean act like petulant children. It means sit down and have a delicious meal with me. He waved his hands, causing two other chairs to be pulled out right next to the ones he had already pulled out for Lucinda. Then he snapped his fingers, making the odd sisters glide over to those seats and sit down at the table. They looked like puppets on invisible strings, helpless and angry. I will take you home if you promise to be good little witches and eat all your din-din, he said. By the gods, I just realized who you remind me of. You look like Baby Jane. He couldn't stop laughing. You know the movie, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? The odd sisters just looked at him. Nothing? Really? Whatever. Look, if you want me to take you home after dinner, then you'll have to do something for me, he said, his elbow on the table and his chin resting in the palm of his hand. He was grinning at them, and he could feel it was making them ill at ease. But who did these witches think they were, coming to his realm, not laughing at his joke, and demanding they be taken home? Of course he would want something in return. He was the king of the underworld. Hadn't they ever heard of making a deal with the devil? He knew, in general, witches could be rather unhinged. Take his fates, for example. They spoke in riddles and drove him mad with their half-truths, predictions, and constant flaunting of their powers. At least these witches were more tolerable, and a lot more powerful, even if they didn't know it yet. And what would you like, your majesty? What can we do for you? Asked Lucinda, folding her hands like a perfect little schoolgirl, making Hades chuckle under his breath at the unnaturalness of her posture. I haven't decided yet, but once I do, you will be the first to know. We shall seal the deal in blood after dinner, he said as Pain and Panic brought in their feast and poured the wine. But first, let's make a toast to new allies. He raised his glass. To new allies, said Lucinda, forcing a smile and raising her glass. Ruby and Martha raised their glasses as well, but didn't speak. He guessed they were too afraid to speak, so he let it pass. Now tell me, how in blazes did you end up in my domain? he asked, shooing pain and panic away after they finished their placing all the serving platters on the table. The fairy godmother. She was angry with us for trying to help someone, a woman she found unworthy, said Lucinda. She seemed to be the only one of the sisters who felt comfortable speaking in intelligible sentences, as if the other two had no experience with it at all. And the more closely he probed these witches, the more it became clear to him why. But he kept that to himself. I see. And why did this woman need your help? He asked between sips of wine. She had been tricked into a loveless marriage by a man who abused and debased her, and we gave her the means to be rid of him for good. Ah, aren't you little furies? And let me guess, this fairy godmother didn't approve. I think someone might need to teach this fairy godmother creature a lesson and set her wings on fire. She can't just pop witches in and out of my kingdom without so much as an introduction. Who does she think she is? I might pay her a visit, he said, snapping his fingers and causing the flames in the room to blaze more brightly. This sent the odd sisters into peals of laughter and put them instantly at ease. I'd love to see that. You're the last person she'd want visiting the fairylands, said Lucinda. Hades liked these witches, and he was happy to have laughter in his dining hall at last. After dinner, he moved their little party out to his balcony, which looked out majestically onto the dark waters of the river Styx, while they drank more pomegranate wine from skulled chalices. Hades was enjoying the company of these witches and loved hearing about their exploits. They talked endlessly about their little sister, whom they loved more than anything in this or any other world, and how they had tried to help a queen in their lands named Grimhilda by trapping her abusive father in a mirror and making him her servant. But the queen went mad, and now was trapped within that same mirror, which was in the possession of a young woman they despised named Snow White. Hades wanted to hear more of their stories, but it was almost time to send the witches back to their own lands. As much as he loved their company and wished they could stay, he did say he would take them home after dinner, but perhaps he could tempt them to stay a little longer. It was worth a try. I suppose I can't talk you into dessert? What's your favorite? But before they could answer, he had gleaned it from Martha's mind. Her thoughts weren't so masterfully veiled as her sister's. Cake? That's your favorite? Then cake we shall have, said Hades, snapping his fingers and making a cake appear. I guess it wouldn't hurt to stay a little longer, said Ruby, accepting the slice of cake from Hades while Lucinda shot daggers at her. Don't be such a witch in a ditch, Lucinda. Have some cake, said Hades, and Lucinda acquiesced after seeing how much her sister was enjoying it. It seemed to Hades the odd sisters forgot they were eager to get back to the many kingdoms as they munched cake and told him stories about their various adventures, until at last Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha finished the entire cake, put down their forks, and stood up from the table. Are you sure you can't stay a while longer? You don't want to miss watching the dead ushered in on the ferry. It's a deliciously macabre sight, Hades said, but he knew it was time to send them home. He saw it in their hearts. We have to get back to our little sister. She's going to be worried about us. Hades could see they were truly anxious about their sister, and he knew he couldn't delay them any longer. I suppose this is where we say our goodbyes, then, he said, waving his hand to create a flaming blue vortex. It was a window into another world, the witches' world. The witches' world, the many kingdoms. They could see the odd sister's house surrounded by rose bushes on the other side of the portal. It had a roof shaped like a witch's cap, round windows, and a lone apple tree. It looked like a delightful little dwelling, one he hoped to visit soon. I'm going to miss the sound of your voices in my dining hall. You really know how to liven the place up, he said, waiting for them to laugh. Anyway, you're much more fun than the sourpuss know-it-all Fates. He was surprised he was a little sad to see them go. But a deal was a deal. He said he would send them home, and that's what he's going to do. Thank you, Lord of the Dead, for everything. We will not forget this, said Lucinda, looking longingly at her house through the vortex. Hades could see she was looking for this little sister they were so eager to get back to, and it made him curious to meet her. Yes, please come by any time you wish for a spot of tea. Oh, that's Ruby. We will never turn you away if you bring another one of those delicious cakes, said Ruby. She and Martha both seemed more comfortable with their new way of speaking, though he could tell they both still seemed nervous about something. Goodbye, our great and exalted king. Please don't hesitate to let us know if there's anything we can do to return the favor, said Martha, flinching when Lucinda stopped on her foot with a pointed boot and glaring. Oh, Lucinda, you tricky little witch, do you think I forgot about our blood oath? You thought you could get away without honoring your promise to me. Lucinda didn't answer. She didn't have to. Hades could read it on her mind and hear it read it on her face and hear it in her mind. These witches might be powerful, but they were not quite as powerful as gods. Lucinda had, in fact, thought he had forgotten. No matter. He probably would have tried to do the same thing given the chance if he were in their situation. Hades said, You must realize that by dining with me, I could make you stay in the underworld as my eternal guests. We have no need for a blood oath." "Then why even mention the oath?" asked Lucinda. "Because I was curious to see if you have a sinister turn of mind. And it seems you do. We have a lot in common, my little pettifoggers. But let's make something clear. I may find you dingbats amusing, but that doesn't mean I won't hold you to your promise. I can and will bring you back to the underworld for good if you refuse to honor your deal with me. Now off you go," he said, waving goodbye to his new friends. "I'll be seeing you again soon."